Chapter 4. England. Dawning Court. Ye old Crusader was nearly empty. Murray, the tavern keeper, was absently wiping the cups with his dingy grey apron while watching the lone occupant with naked suspicion. When the door opened, he looked up, but his shoulders slumped when he recognized John. While a customer was ordinarily not something Murray would have complained about, John only cost Murray. John entered and sauntered to the bar. A large man, he was clearly once very muscular and powerful, but now his bulk sagged and his belly hung far over his belt, a consequence of his endless thirst. As Murray slid a cup of cheap wine toward him, John smiled and patted his finely tailored clothes, now threadbare and roughly patched, as if looking for his money. "Leave your money where it is, Sir John," Murray said apathetically. "It is no good here, you know that." John smiled, took up the cup, and dropped heavily onto a stool. Murray moved quickly away, lest his real feelings for this oaf betray him. "Why such a troubled countenance?" a hard alto voice asked. John looked up in surprise. He had not even noticed the woman at the table behind him. "Is it that obvious?" John turned in his stool and tried to see around the hood that obscured her face. What could make such a mighty warrior, one with so many conquests under his belt and a barony at his feet, so troubled? "A mighty warrior?" he asked, still trying to see under her hood. "I know you, Sir John. There is no sense pretending that you are other than you are. Even in these humble surroundings, your greatness cannot be concealed." John was unsure how to respond. Something told him to be wary of this woman, but the soothing effect of the wine and his depression both agreed that this was the first good thing he had heard in a long time, and he wasn't willing to turn his back on it just yet. "What weighs on your mind?" she pressed. "My current situation defies description," he said, looking deep into his cup. "Perhaps elucidating on your woes would present some solution? And they would certainly sound better over a drink," she said, gesturing toward her empty cup. "Yes, well, I do not think..." The refusal he had been working on never emerged. The woman pushed back her hood, and John's heart leapt into his throat, choking off his words as he gazed upon the most beautiful Saracen woman he had ever seen. Her lustrous black hair, black almond eyes, and high cheekbones gave her an exotic appearance that instantly excited him. "Murray, 2 more of these," he ordered. Without speaking, Murray set another cup beside John's and filled them both. He gave John a meaningful stare, but John didn't notice. He was too focused on the beauty before him. She was still looking straight ahead as if she did not notice he was gawking at her. "What may I call you?" John tried to sound casual as he set the drinks on the table and took the chair opposite her. His heart was beating quickly and he felt flustered, like a schoolboy trying to strike up a conversation with the object of his affection. She took a sip of the cheap wine, ignoring his question. "Now tell me, what has brought Sir John Dawning, the mightiest of all the Dawning men, to this?" She indicated the dank tavern. "Your knowledge of my situation seems beyond that of a casual observer," John said, smiling as he evaded her question. "All know of you. Everything your family does is significant. The local economy rises or falls according to when the Dawnings empty their bowels." "Look, I never asked for that," John said, waving his meaty hands. "Why does that matter? None of us asked for the life to which we were born, but that does not absolve us of the responsibilities that come with it." "I do not have to take this," John snapped. "I came in here to get drunk and thought some company might be nice. Seems I was mistaken about the company, but I could still have the drink." He started to rise. She leaned forward and placed a slender hand over his large, calloused one. "It is not too late for you. Your life may yet have meaning if you use that power that was so unwillingly inherited for something great." John hesitated a moment. No, but I thank you," he said, pulling his hand free and picking up his drink as he stood. "I thank you for providing the perfect end to a perfect day." "You were not meant to be a farmer," she said to his retreating back. "You were meant for greatness. Will you content yourself to live in the shadows of your younger brothers when it is you who should be barren?" There was a note of urgency in her voice. John stopped, for she had struck a nerve. He looked at her over his shoulder. "What do you know of such things?" She stood and moved close to him. She was taller than most women, but still her head only reached his chin. "I know there is more in store for you than you have ever imagined, if you will but let me prove it to you." She placed a hand on his shoulder and stared into his eyes. John considered her words and possible motives and decided that he wasn't in any real danger. After all, he thought, what benefit could she gain by killing the disgraced son of a nobleman? Particularly when there were so many other sons to take his place. Besides, she is so beautiful. What harm could there be in listening to her just a little longer? "Perhaps we might go somewhere that we may talk," she suggested. John cleared his throat. "I cannot be seen to escort you anywhere until I have learned your name." "Anissa," she said, and turned toward the exit. John stood rooted in place, admiring her form as she glided across the room. He suddenly realized she was getting away and set his drink down quickly in order to follow. "Psst! Sir John!" Murray hissed. John stopped mid-stride and looked at the tavern keeper curiously. "Sir John, I thought you should be aware that woman has been coming in here every night for days and has never spoken to anyone until tonight," he said quietly. John glanced over to where Anissa watched him patiently. "And?" "She is a Moorish woman, Sir John. She may have designs on your noble person. I would advise caution." John looked again at the tall, slender form in the doorway. She was so beautiful that he found himself angry at the tavern keeper's insinuation. "Have you ever been over there? Have you ever fought the Saracens or lived among them?" he demanded. "No, Sir John." Murray dropped his eyes. "And yet you do arrogate the right to advise me. What license have you to hold a prejudice against a people you do not know? I have been over there. I have talked with them and fought with them. I have had friends struck down by them. If I can overlook that prejudice, then what excuse can you make for yourself?" "Yes, Sir John, I am sorry," Murray apologized, not looking up. "I only wanted to make you aware." John was still angry, but realized the tavern keeper meant no harm. He took a deep breath and sighed. "I too am sorry," he said, then added loudly enough for Anissa to hear, "I know you were only conducting yourself as a loyal subject, and I thank you for it." "Yes," Murray said. John followed as Anissa led him from the tavern, past the town square, and down a lonely road. They were some distance out before John finally broke the silence. "I am as yet unenlightened as to how you are going to restore me to my former glory." "I never said I would restore you to your former glory," Anissa said simply. "Ah," John said, not surprised, but still disappointed somehow. He had expected their conversation would ultimately come to this, he just didn't think it would come so quickly. "No, John. I will help you achieve far greater glory than you ever dreamed. You need not content yourself with merely restoring a station that was never worthy of you. You are the blood of millennia of powerful rulers, rulers to whom even kings show deference. Everyone knows you are a great warrior, Sir John, but you are far more than that." "Ah," John said noncommittally. "Did you have dreams as a child, John?" "Dreams?" he asked. "You mean like nightmares?" "I mean daydreams of glory and power, and what you wanted from your life." John shrugged. "I concede that I did." Anissa cast her arm over the serfs' huts scattered among the fields and the dirty town square visible in the distance behind them. "And in those dreams," she asked, "did you ever imagine that your purview would be limited to a simple field in the lands of another man or woman?" John understood her meaning. He was the heir to Dawning Court, but he was nothing but a peasant to his mother, who was holding the baron's seat until a worthy male heir was chosen to take his father's place. Anissa's question stung him, but he shrugged it off. "Not likely, since I always knew I would be baron, assuming Richard did not find some way of doing me in first." "So how did you end up here? How did it come to this?" John only shrugged again. "You could have stood up to Martha Dawning and demanded your birthright, yet you did nothing. Why is that?" "My mother has not had an easy life, and it did not seem right to deprive her of all that is left to her of her husband and his legacy," John said uneasily. Anissa rounded on him, her dark pupils boring into his soft brown eyes until he dropped his gaze. Left to her? She asked, her voice a mix of confusion and consternation. Left to her? John, Donincourt belongs to you. Do you not realize that? John wilted under the scrutiny of this foreign beauty. His embarrassment made him want to lash out at her, but he only stood like a child being scolded by his mother, unable to meet her gaze. I am not going to kill my own mother over a position I am uncertain I could fill adequately. Anissa's jaw tightened. She stepped forward and shook his arm until he met her gaze. Of course. Why would you desire to upset the woman who has contrived, literally from your first day, to make you nothing, less than nothing? Contrived, John said, stepping around her so he could continue walking and escape her gaze. What nonsense is this? Nonsense, she said, catching up to him. Is it nonsense, then? Ask yourself, who has kept you from your inheritance? You were reared to be a great warrior. Who then stripped you of the right to be great? Who took from you the knighthood that you earned? And now, what are you good for? A disavowed member of the chivalry. Can you seek your fortune at war as your father did, marching before the army where you belong? John could not help seeing the truth in what she was saying. He was a warrior from a long line of warriors, and it was all he knew how to be. But since he was no longer considered a knight, he could no longer march with the army of Donincourt, or receive rewards as such. What other skills are you equipped with? Anissa goaded him further. Are you a farmer, or a thatcher, or a tailor? She paused before again stepping in front of him and drawing near. Martha Dawning did not simply deny you of your rightful inheritance, she said quietly. She stripped you of every opportunity for a warrior's glory, a warrior's noble life and glorious death. She robbed you of every chance to live a productive, useful life. Instead, she forced you to rot out here, toiling away your days until you are dumped into a pauper's grave. John stared at Anissa for a long moment, turning her words over in his head. What are you proposing? He asked cautiously. She smiled at him and stepped so close that the scent of her perfumed hair filled him with longing, and he trembled to feel her against him. But still she did not touch him. Instead, she stood on her toes and whispered in his ear, Think about what I have said. Think very carefully. What is your own life worth to you? Her lips brushed his ear and goosebumps broke out all over his body. If you decide you are worth something after all, then meet me back here tomorrow night. She placed a hand at the back of his head, pulling it down to force John to meet her eyes. I know you are great, John. I just need you to realize it. She released his head, turned off the road, and disappeared into the darkness. John watched her go, her scent lingering in his nostrils and the feeling of her lips still warming his ear. It wasn't until she disappeared entirely that he snapped out of his reverie. Wait, he called. Meet you where? Here? He looked around at the empty road. They had passed the last of the serfs' cottages and were now on a stretch of road that led to Baron Braddock's lands. Why here? He called, but got no answer. And when tomorrow night? If I choose to return, he suddenly added, afraid he sounded too interested. It was not lost on John that Anissa left many unanswered questions, but he could not seem to focus on those at the moment. All he could think about was the contrast between the beginning of his day and now. In the last 2 hours he had not only met the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, but also found that she was very interested in him. And now, because of her, he was beginning to see the beginning of a possible escape from this dismal life he had carved for himself, or rather, this dismal life into which he had been thrust. He turned for home with a new spring in his step. I should mention this to Lindsay, he thought. No, not yet, he corrected himself. I need to make sure it is real. Besides, wives can be so jealous. Chapter 5. Egypt. Damietta. Tahir again urged his men to silence, but with so many assembled, even the smallest sounds, a clink of armor here, a cough there, the hard tang of metal bumping against metal, were multiplied and seemed to create a great racket. The noise played particular havoc with Tahir's tensed nerves as he waited behind the gates of Damietta. He listened for any indication of how the battle outside the walls was progressing. Were the Crusaders being driven back into the sea, or were his men being crushed? He did not expect his men to defeat the Crusaders by themselves, as only half of them were outside the walls. His real power was behind him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Nevertheless, he prayed, asking Allah to watch over those brave souls. Tahir's hair was gray with age, but his arm was still as strong as any of his men. An experienced general, he had been protecting his city from the endless sea of Crusaders for as long as he could remember. During times like this, he wondered where all the heathens came from, and if they would ever exhaust themselves on the rock of his arm. Though their trappings had changed little over the years, one ironclad Crusader looked very much like another, Tahir had to admit that they had gotten smarter. Each new army was more clever than the one before, and Tahir began to fear that the day would come when he could no longer protect his people. But today was not that day. This surety was not born of Tahir's confidence in his own abilities, but rather because he had been forced into striking a bargain with men whom he ordinarily would have had no dealings. Of all these odious men, who clearly had sinister motives they would not share with Tahir, the giant that had appeared to warn him of the impending attack was a particularly foreboding man. He knew things he should not have known, and held sway in places he should have carried no influence. Even the town elders gave him audience and acted according to his suggestions. When word of the current attack had come, many of the elders had insisted the citizens remain inside the walls and wait out the Crusaders. Tahir had been unable to convince them that the city was not prepared for a siege. He explained that they had not planned for an attack this late in the year and didn't have sufficient supplies. He told them that if they allowed a siege to begin, the Crusaders would simply be able to starve them out. Despite his arguments, the elders refused to listen until the giant arrived. After the giant gained audience with them, it was only a few days until the majority of the elders sided with Tahir. In addition to siding with him, they went so far as to place him in charge of the city's defenses. Tahir knew the giant's help would come at a terrible price, but for today, the giant's request was simple. Ridiculous, but simple. While Tahir was fighting to protect his home and people, the giant expected him to watch for one particular enemy infantryman amidst thousands of Crusaders. Tahir had protested that he may never see this man, or may not recognize him even if he did. It could be, Tahir had explained, that this white warrior may be struck down before I ever laid eyes on him. But the giant had assured him that Tahir would see him and would recognize him at once. What nonsense. William leaned on his spear as he watched the sleeping city of Damietta, a dark mass against a gray sky. William's detachment was part of a second wave of assaults in a two-pronged attack that was designed to break the resistance once and for all. The first assault would come against the city from the Nile. The plan was for these men to engage the enemy and keep them busy while William and his group swooped in to attack the unprotected side of the city. It was a good plan, and it should work, he thought, provided it had not been leaked to the enemy. He took satisfaction in knowing he and the other leaders had taken the utmost care to protect it. Only the generals knew what was planned, and they kept it to themselves. Any information they passed on was deliberately incorrect and confusing to throw any would-be spies off the trail. William was largely responsible for the plan and loved it for its simplicity. An army was a massive beast that was infinitely dumber than the dumbest rodent, infinitely slower than the slowest insect, and yet more powerful than a wildfire, and it needed to be handled accordingly. Overly elaborate plans rarely worked in the bedlam of battle, but small subtleties often had devastating effects against an opposing army. "Is this the day, William?" William started as Gorm's voice snapped him out of his reverie. "What day is that, your lordship?" "The day when God's judgment will be passed upon us for our many sins." William looked up at his commander innocently. "What crimes could I have committed?" "Come now, William," Gorm chided him. "Are you telling me that you are different from every man out here? That you do not contemplate your return to your Maker when you stand before the field of battle? Do you not wonder if your end is here? If the angel of death does not have you on his list this day?" William did not want to admit it, but this was the very thing he contemplated before each battle. "When the time comes, will we know?" he blurted without thinking. "Will there be a feeling in the air or some sense of foreboding, perhaps?" Gorm looked down at him, once again struck by his youth. "There is nothing wrong with fear, William. It is only that we must not allow our men to see it." "Fear?" William seemed genuinely surprised. "You mistake my curiosity for fear. I am quite prepared to die. I even deserve to die. And that is what I find so curious. I enter each battle with relish, expecting God's judgment to be passed upon me, yet I emerge from each battle with rarely more than a scratch, while all around me better men are struck down." Gorm considered William. "That which God has seen to protect, I do not question. I only express my gratitude that you are on my side of the battle," he grinned, but William only grunted. Gorm changed the subject. "Do you think they know? Could those who first settled this area for its choice location here where the Nile meets the sea, could they have realized what a target they were destined to become?" William shrugged his mind on other topics. "Damietta is the key to this part of the world. He who controls Damietta controls the Nile, and he who controls the Nile controls Egypt. I suspect that has always been the way of this place." A roar washed over the two men. Gorm looked to the brightening eastern sky where the sun had not quite peaked over the horizon and nodded approvingly. "The Frisians are right on time. I best return to my men. I cannot have them conquering Damietta without me." He smiled at William and took his place at the head of a host of mounted knights. They were a majestic sight with their silver armor glittering in the early morning light, and their pennants fluttering in the cool air. A pang of envy filled William for the briefest of moments. However hollow it might be, these men represented a tradition of honor and valor of which he could never be a part. Gorm raised his sword high in the air. "For God and country!" he called, and spurred his destrier down the hill toward the city. In the first rays of dawn, when it was only just possible to distinguish friend from foe, the cavalry rushed the battle that was already underway at the harbor. The soldiers from the city were well engaged on the Mediterranean side and never saw Gorm's cavalry until he cut a swath of destruction through their unprotected flank. Everything was going exactly as planned. William's infantry sprinted down the hill toward the city. He and his men were to sack the defenses of the city, while Damietta's army was occupied at the harbor. He was racing across the open area in front of the city when the early dawn light was almost completely obscured by an immense dark cloud that arose suddenly from Damietta. William expected little opposition from the city itself. The Damiettans would likely have left nothing more than a skeleton crew to man the battlements, so he almost missed the significance of the cloud in the low light. It was nearly too late when he understood what was happening. "Cover!" he roared over the din of the field. Not a moment was lost. Not a man hesitated before throwing his shield overhead and crouching down as the hail of arrows clattered around them. They plinked off shields and armor. They embedded themselves in the ground like stalks of wheat. And for those who were not careful enough or well protected enough, they cut into flesh. William was surprised that the Saracens would have left so many archers on the walls when their army was making its last stand at the harbor. It was also strange that the darkened city appeared to sleep while its army fought for its survival. He would have expected it to be alive with activity. Nevertheless, when the hailstorm stopped, he shouted the command to resume the charge. His men rushed ahead until they were again forced to take cover as the sky was once again darkened by the shadow of hundreds of arrows. When they arose this time, however, the gates of the city were open and a sea of Saracen soldiers was streaming out upon them. "Ambush!" William roared. The Moors must have been tipped off as to what the knights were planning. William cursed the inability of an army to keep a secret and hunkered down under another storm of arrows. It would be difficult for the archers to shoot effectively once the new soldiers were engaged, but they could keep William's army pinned down enough to give the defenders the initial advantage. The moment the last arrow dropped, William roused his men and charged into the sea of newcomers. Like two mighty waves colliding, William's company crashed into the Moors that were still pouring from the city gates. William hurled his shield at the unprotected head of a nearby Damiettan and impaled his next victim on the end of his spear. He felt the familiar rush of battle and strength surge through him. On an impulse, he raised the dying man up on his spear and flung his body into another approaching Saracen. The enemy soldier stumbled in an effort to avoid the grotesque projectile, only to be met by the end of William's spear. Whirling, William stabbed at an exposed face. His spear's unusually long reach often took the average sword-wielding soldier by surprise. However, this more instinctively jerked back and only received a deep gash on his cheek. William instantly closed the distance. Stepping forward, he swung his spear in a wide arc around his head, its heavy ash shaft catching the man on the side of the head. He crumpled to the ground. Then, as it always did, the way opened before him, and he took it. William charged deep into the enemy line. It was the same challenge he had issued so many times before, a challenge to death himself. He pushed far into the opposing army until he was surrounded by enemies on every side and completely cut off from help. He was throwing the gauntlet down before the heavens, challenging them not to kill him. The angel of death should have taken him long ago, but he had not. Now with each new battle, William waited and watched for him. He wanted death to take him now while he was prepared, rather than at some future time when he least expected or desired it. William charged into a thick group of soldiers and ran the point of his weapon through the ribs of a Moor who had made the fatal mistake of failing to notice an enemy so far behind his own lines. Jerking his weapon from the body of another victim, William closed the distance to the next man. The Saracen swung wildly to fend off William's attack, but William caught the slash on the side of his spear and, spinning, pinned the man's sword arm beneath his own arm and body. With his free hand, William swung the back end of the spear under the Moor's feet and swept them from beneath him. The Moor hit the ground hard, and William finished him with a quick stab. William looked up to find his next victim and saw a Saracen soldier standing over one of William's infantry who had stumbled and fallen back near the battle line. From the ground, William's man was helpless. William knew that he could not cover the 30 feet between them in time to rescue his man, so he did the only thing he could think of. He hurled his spear at the Moor. The spear sailed true, and the unsuspecting enemy arched his back in agony as the sharp blade sunk into his kidney, dropping him in a heap. The prostrate soldier glanced over at William, smiled his thanks, and then jumped to his feet and back in the fight. An overnight peasant-made soldier saw William unarmed and quickly advanced on him. William locked eyes with the Saracen youth and reached back over his shoulder, slowly and deliberately drawing his katana. He let the finely crafted weapon sing as it left its sheath. The slightly curved blade caught the morning light, highlighting the striations that ran in close lines down its length. The unusual but obviously rare weapon, coupled with William's own striking appearance, had the intended effect upon the Moor boy who stopped short in his tracks. What to the boy had only a moment ago seemed an easy kill, now looked menacing indeed. William and the youth were only a moment thus locked on each other's faces when William was forced to knock aside the blade of another soldier who appeared between them. He spun, dropping low, and sliced a deep cut in the side of the Moor's thigh. The Saracen boy watched as his much more experienced ally was dropped without so much as an exchange of blows. The boy began to back away, but it was too late. William leapt over the downed soldier toward him. Tahir rushed out the gates ahead of his men. He was aiming to crush the small wave of the Crusaders' infantry before they could be reinforced from the troops enmeshed in the battle at the harbor with what they presumed to be the entirety of the Damianid army. Typical Christian arrogance, Tahir thought, to assume Muslims lack any cunning or forethought. Like rodents, they see us as fit for nothing but extermination. It was all too common for the Christians to disdain his people and assume they were weak and stupid. This was a prejudice that served Tahir very well. Tahir's men crashed into the Crusaders. He carved into their ranks with relish. Tahir had dispatched 3 enemy soldiers before he realized that part of his own line had collapsed and was letting enemies stream through. He rushed over to provide support, but stopped short. His heart froze for the briefest of moments as he beheld an angel sent from Allah himself, and he was fighting for the Crusaders. Some 50 paces to Tahir's left, deep behind his own line, was a figure that glowed in white and gold armor in the early morning light. Tahir was mesmerized as he watched this being that seemed to have materialized behind his line. He delivered death with his spear like nothing Tahir had ever seen. He watched the spear whirl, seemingly of its own volition, and the figure leap and spin and jump as a dancer in some elaborate performance. An angel? That was ridiculous. Tahir forced himself out of his trance. Could there be any doubt that this was the white warrior to whom the giant had been referring? Upon seeing him, Tahir now understood why the giant had been so certain that he would encounter this man. The European devil was cutting through his soldiers like blades of grass. Tahir knew at once that no ordinary footman would be able to stop him. This white warrior seemed to know in advance what each of Tahir's men would do. He had to be stopped, and it seemed that his spear was where his real advantage lay. Tahir watched as the white knight hurled it and killed a man, then immediately began fighting his way toward it. Tahir realized that if he could get to the weapon first, he would deprive this warrior of a significant advantage. With a dramatic thrust of his mace, Tahir caused the closest crusader to double over. He lost no time in slamming the heavy weapon onto the back of the Christian's helmet, causing a sizable dent that told him his job was done. He took a few rapid steps toward the enemy's spear, but so did the white knight. Several of Tahir's men intervened to keep the possessed knight from reaching his favored weapon, and Tahir breathed a sigh of relief. He was almost there. An ironclad knight suddenly stood before him in full armor. Unhorsed early in the cavalry charge when his mount had stumbled, the knight had been swept up with the infantry. Tahir cursed at him. "Get out of my way!" he ordered in Arabic, but of course the European did not obey. The Europeans never took time to learn anything about the people they were trying to destroy. Even so, Tahir now had a problem. Knights were encased in iron, and dispatching them could be a long and frustrating ordeal. It could take even the most skilled warrior some time to find a weak spot and exploit it. Tahir was not afraid, but he was vexed at the delay. "Move aside!" he ordered again, this time in French. The knight responded by raising his sword. Tahir roared angrily and smashed the knight's blade aside. These knights were the reason Tahir had taken to using a mace against the Crusaders rather than his preferred blade. Blades were often ineffective against someone completely clad in iron, but maces were a different story. Tahir swung again and again, furiously driving the knight back. He was not far from the white knight now, and even closer to the devil's spear. Tahir's opponent tried desperately to defend himself, but his end came when his heel caught on the body of a fallen man, and he tumbled backward. Tahir was instantly on him, smashing his visor over and over until the knight stopped moving. Tahir looked up, panting. The white warrior was just dispatching the last man in his way, but he was too late. Tahir was triumphant. He had beaten the white warrior to his weapon. The very body that had tripped up the knight had been the one killed by the thrown spear minutes before. With an exultant cry, Tahir jerked the weapon from the corpse. He had only used a spear a handful of times, as he had always viewed it as a clumsy, inexpensive weapon for unskilled, expendable foot soldiers. But then he had never seen anyone use it the way this man had. In his hands it was a refined instrument of death with clear advantages. Holding the weapon in both hands, Tahir leveled it at the white knight's chest, halting his charge at once. Tahir stepped forward and swung the weapon in a wide arc at the knight's midsection, trying to duplicate a move he had seen him perform moments before. The awkwardness of the weapon carried it well past his intended target and left Tahir's flank open. The white knight took advantage of the opening and flicked his sword at Tahir's side, cutting a jagged gash. Tahir looked down at the wound in surprise and confusion. Rethinking his strategy, he made a savage but clumsy thrust toward the knight's chest. The white knight seemed to be expecting it. He parried Tahir's blow, stepped in close, and seized the shaft of the spear with his free hand. In the same fluid movement, he put his right foot on Tahir's chest and shoved him violently backward, landing him in the dirt. Before Tahir had a chance to collect himself, the knight was standing over him with his foot planted on Tahir's torso, the spear point held at his throat. This was the end. Tahir looked up at his executioner, and his eyes widened as he recognized the man. This was no angel of death, but a mere man, and not just any man. "I know you," Tahir spat. "I was told I would recognize you. You look just like your doggerel father. Have you come here to finish the murdering and pillaging that your villainous father began so long ago?" The white knight's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You knew my father?" "He too tried to take my city and failed, just as you will fail." The knight only grinned malevolently. "When you get to hell, give Braden my regards." Tahir made as if to reply, and instead kicked the young knight in the stomach. The blow lifted him off the ground and sent him stumbling backward. Tahir snatched a weapon from the ground and leapt to his feet. He now knew something about this knight, and this was a fight he was determined not to lose. William was sparring with an aging but particularly able Moor. William's pride had forced him to respond glibly to his opponent's comments about his father, but suddenly he found himself very curious to know if this man had actually known his father. Braden died when William was very young, and William had very few actual memories of him. William blocked a stroke on the shaft of his spear and returned to strike at his opponent's head. The Moor ducked. William spun around and swung another blow at his legs, but he jumped clear just in time. The Moor then jabbed a quick thrust at William's chest. William was forced to lurch back to avoid the strike. In the short pause this created, he realized with sudden clarity how distracted he had become from the battle at large. He was allowing this single opponent to remove his attention from the precarious state of his men who were on the verge of defeat from an overwhelming force they had not expected to encounter. "Sound the signal! Sound the signal!" William shouted to his second. His opponent advanced on him with malice in his eyes. William's second dispatched another enemy and fumbled with the horn tied over his shoulder. Putting it to his lips, he blew a great long note. Then, after a short pause, blew another. Most of the Saracens were far too involved in the battle at large to pay any attention to the horn, but William's opponent heard it. The intensity in his eyes drained away and was rapidly replaced by fear. He realized what was happening and turned toward his own line of men. "Retreat!" he shouted. "It is a trap! Retreat!" Fearing he would alert the Moors to the imminent third strike that was about to take them by surprise, William lunged at him. The Moor's attention was no longer on William, but on sounding the call to retreat for his own army. He drew breath for another call, and William's spear sunk deep into his lung. He gurgled something unintelligible and dropped. None of the men of Damietta had heard his warning call, and they were not prepared for the new force that fell on them. The new wave of Crusaders swept down onto the field, and the tide turned quickly against the defenders. Hours later, as the last of the Saracens were being routed, William paused amid the chaos. He looked for the angel of death, but death was not interested in William. Not this day. Perhaps now, William allowed himself to consider for the first time, my years of service to the church and the cause have in some measure atoned for my many wrongdoings. A cool breeze swept over the field, and a feeling of elation pierced William to the core. He was jubilant at the success of the battle, the closing of this horrible chapter of his life, and most of all, at the possibility that perhaps, after all was said and done, he had been forgiven. Maybe there was mercy and peace to be found while still in the flesh.